Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/BrianEDenton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Chapter 148. Next day, by Maria Dmitrievna's advice, Count Rostov took Natasha to call on Prince Nicholas Bolkonsky. The Count did not set out cheerfully on this visit. At heart, he felt afraid. He well remembered the last interview he had had with the old prince at the time of the enrollment, when in reply to an invitation to dinner, he had to listen to an angry reprimand for not having provided his full quota of men. Natasha, on the other hand, having put on her best gown, was in the highest spirits. They can't help liking me, she thought. Everybody has always liked me, and I am so willing to do anything they wish, so ready to be fond of him, for being his father, and of her, for being his sister, that there is no reason for them not to like me. They drove up to the gloomy old house on the Vodoshenka and entered the vestibule. "Well, the Lord have mercy on us," said the Count, half in jest, half in earnest. But Natasha noticed that her father was flurried on entering the anteroom, and inquired timidly and softly whether the prince and princess were at home. When they had announced, a perturbation was noticeable among the servants. The footman who had gone to announce them was stopped by another in the large hall, and they whispered to one another. Then a maidservant ran into the hall, and hurriedly said something, mentioning the princess. At last, an old, cross-looking footman came and announced to the Rostovs that the prince was not receiving, but that the princess begged them to walk up. The first person who came to meet the visitors was Mademoiselle Bourrienne. She greeted the father and daughter with special politeness and showed them to the princess's room. The princess, looking excited and nervous, her face flushed in patches, ran in to meet the visitors, treading heavily, and vainly trying to appear cordial and at ease. From the first glance, Princess Mary did not like Natasha. She thought her too fashionably dressed, frivolously gay and vain. She did not at all realize that before having seen her future sister-in-law, she was prejudiced against her by involuntary envy of her beauty, youth, and happiness, as well as by jealousy of her brother's love for her. Apart from this insuperable antipathy to her, Princess Mary was agitated just then because on the Rostovs being announced, the old prince had shouted that he did not wish to see them, that Princess Mary might do so if she chose, but they were not to be admitted to him. She had decided to receive them, but feared lest the prince might at any moment indulge in some freak, as he seemed much upset by the Rostovs' visit. "There, my dear princess, I've brought you my songstress," said the Count, bowing and looking round uneasily, as if afraid the old prince might appear. "I am so glad you should get to know one another. Very sorry the prince is still ailing." And after a few more commonplace remarks, he rose. "If you will allow me to leave my Natasha in your hands for a quarter of an hour, princess, I'll drive around to see Anna Semenova. It's quite near the Dog Square, and then I'll come back for her." The Count had devised this diplomatic ruse, as he afterward told his daughter, to give the future sisters-in-law an opportunity to talk to one another freely, but another motive was to avoid the danger of encountering the old prince, of whom he was very afraid. He did not mention this to his daughter, but Natasha noticed her father's nervousness and anxiety, and felt mortified by it. She blushed for him, grew still angrier at having blushed, and looked at the princess with a bold and defiant expression, which said that she was not afraid of anybody. The princess told the Count that she would be delighted, and only begged him to stay longer at Anna Semenova's, and he departed. Despite the uneasy glances thrown at her by Princess Mary, who wished to have a tete-a-tete with Natasha, Mademoiselle Bourrienne remained in the room and persistently talked about Moscow amusements and theaters. Natasha felt offended by the hesitation she had noticed in the anteroom, by her father's nervousness, and by the unnatural manner of the princess, who, she thought, was making a favor of receiving her, and so everything displeased her. She did not like Princess Mary, whom she thought very plain, affected, and dry. Natasha suddenly shrank into herself and involuntarily assumed an offhand air, which alienated Princess Mary still more. After 5 minutes of irksome, constrained conversation, they heard the sound of slippered feet rapidly approaching. Princess Mary looked frightened. The door opened, and the old prince, in a dressing gown and a white nightcap, came in. "Ah, madame," he began. "Madame, Countess Rostova, if I'm not mistaken. I beg you to excuse me. I did not know, madame. God is my witness. I did not know you had honored us with a visit, and I came in such a costume only to see my daughter. I beg you to excuse me. God is my witness. I didn't know," he repeated, stressing the word God so unnaturally and so unpleasantly that Princess Mary stood with downcast eyes, not daring to look either at her father or at Natasha. Nor did the latter, having risen and curtsied, know what to do. Mademoiselle Bourienne alone smiled agreeably. "I beg you to excuse me. God is my witness, I did not know," muttered the old man, and after looking Natasha over from head to foot, he went out. Mademoiselle Bourienne was the first to recover herself after this apparition, and began speaking about the prince's indisposition. Natasha and Princess Mary looked at one another in silence, and the longer they did so without saying what they wanted to say, the greater grew their antipathy to one another. When the Count returned, Natasha was impolitely pleased, and hastened to get away. At that moment she hated the stiff elderly princess who could place her in such an embarrassing position, and had spent half an hour with her without once mentioning Prince Andrew. "I couldn't begin talking about him in the presence of that Frenchwoman," thought Natasha. The same thought was meanwhile tormenting Princess Mary. She knew that she ought to have said to Natasha, but she had been unable to say it because Mademoiselle Bourienne was in the way, and because, without knowing why, she felt it very difficult to speak of the marriage. When the Count was already leaving the room, Princess Mary went up hurriedly to Natasha, took her by the hand, and said with a deep sigh, "Wait, I must—" Natasha glanced at her ironically, without knowing why. "Dear Natalie," said Princess Mary, "I want you to know that I am glad my brother has found happiness." She paused, feeling that she was not telling the truth. Natasha noticed this and guessed its reason. "I think, Princess, it is not convenient to speak of that now," she said with an external dignity and coldness, though she felt the tears choking her. "What have I said and what have I done?" thought she, as soon as she was out of the room. They waited a long time for Natasha to come to dinner that day. She sat in her room crying like a child, blowing her nose and sobbing. Sonia stood beside her, kissing her hair. "Natasha, what is it all about?" she asked. "What do they matter to you? It will all pass, Natasha." "But if you only knew how offensive it was, as if I—" "Don't talk about it, Natasha. It wasn't your fault, so why should you mind? Kiss me," said Sonia. Natasha raised her head, and kissing her friend on the lips, pressed her wet face against her. "I can't tell you. I don't know. No one's to blame," said Natasha. "It's my fault. But it all hurts so terribly. Oh, why doesn't he come?" She came into dinner with red eyes. Maria Dmitrievna, who knew how the prince had received the Rostovs, pretended not to notice how upset Natasha was, and jested resolutely and loudly at the table with the Count and the other guests. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 148. I'll now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, day 148. What we talk about when we talk about Marty McFly being called the chicken. The tyranny of the fear of another's judgment will slay you if you allow it to. That's the lesson of today's reading, as both generations of Rostovs fall victim to this awful tyranny when they call upon the Bolkonsky household. The old Count is the first to go down. It doesn't look good for him from the start. He's already nervous once he enters the home, because the last time he met with Bolkonsky, the old prince berated him for not supplying a full quota of men for the war effort. Count Rostov cannot bear another reprimand, weak man that he is. He designs a ruse to escape the feared wrath of Bolkonsky by asking to leave Natasha alone for a few minutes while he goes to call on Semenova for some unspecified reason. Some guy, this one. What a chicken shit. Natasha fares only a little better. At least she doesn't enter the home coward in fear. Not at first, anyway. She thinks she'll make a good impression on him because, well, she always makes a good impression on everybody, and everybody likes her. It turns out that the old prince doesn't like her. Neither does Mary. That much is clear. She spends the rest of the chapter crying alone in a room. What fearsome object is it exactly that can cower a grown man and send a beautiful, otherwise confident young woman to cry alone in a room? Merely an old man in a dressing gown and a white cap? It'd be hard for Tolstoy to conjure a more ridiculous image for us. And yet, the terror the old prince places in the hearts of those he meets is legendary. Is this, the opinion of an old man in a dressing gown and a white nightcap, really the thing we should allow to disturb our mental tranquility? Daily meditation. Do not waste the remainder of thy life in thoughts about others, when thou dost not refer thy thoughts to some object of common utility. For thou losest the opportunity of doing something else when thou hast such thoughts as these. What is such a person doing, and why? And what is he saying? And what is he thinking of? And what is he contriving? And whatever else of the kind makes us wander away from the observation of our own ruling power. We ought, then, to check in the series of our thoughts everything that is without a purpose and useless, but most of all, the over-curious feeling and the malignant. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. All right, so that concludes my reading and reflection on chapter 148. Thanks so much for joining me today. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation to PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes. Tomorrow we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 149. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.